WNYC.org.
This is WNYC 93.9 FM and HD, New York.
BBC World Service. This is Celia Hatton with The Real Story. One topic, 1 hour every week. This week, we're looking at one of the world's most popular social media apps and its future in the world's most powerful country. What's happening with TikTok in the United States? It's wildly popular, with tens of millions of Americans using it every day, especially those under the age of 25. But politicians on both sides of the U.S. political divide question TikTok's links to its parent company in China. There are real worries about the data TikTok might collect from its users and the ways Beijing might shape the app's content. A bill passed in the U.S. House of Representatives this week could essentially ban TikTok or possibly force its sale to a U.S. owner, though a lot of hurdles remain. So, does TikTok pose a threat? And if so, what can be done about it? That's The Real Story, coming up after the news.
This is the BBC News with Fiona MacDonald. The UN's head of humanitarian affairs has warned that up to 5 million people in Sudan could face catastrophic hunger in the coming months as warring factions continue to devastate the country. Kat Wiener reports.
In a letter to the United Nations Security Council seen by news agencies, Martin Griffiths said that 18 million Sudanese were already facing acute food insecurity as a result of the destruction of agriculture and infrastructure, steep price increases, and the displacement of millions of people. Mr. Griffiths appealed for the parties to the conflict, the Sudanese army and paramilitary rapid support forces, to urgently allow the delivery of humanitarian aid to avert famine conditions, especially in Darfur. The delivery of aid into the region across the border from Chad would, he said, provide a critical lifeline.
Donald Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence has said he will not endorse his old boss in his bid to return to the White House. Speaking to Fox News, Mr. Pence said he couldn't support Mr. Trump in good conscience, and that his decision would come as no surprise to anyone. Will Vernon is in Washington.
There was extraordinarily bad blood between the former president and the former vice president after January the 6th. Donald Trump supporters, when storming the Capitol, were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." But at the same time, plenty of other people whom Mr. Trump has treated pretty badly in the past have recently endorsed him. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump called him untalented and politically dead. And the Texas Senator Ted Cruz, Donald Trump made some pretty unpleasant comments about his wife's appearance. Both of them still endorsed him.
A judge overseeing the election interference case against Donald Trump in the U.S. state of Georgia has rejected an attempt to disqualify the lawyer leading the prosecution. The judge ruled that District Attorney Fani Willis could remain on the case. In a show of unity, the leaders of Germany, France and Poland have agreed to step up the provision of weapons to assist Ukraine in its battle against the Russian invasion. After a meeting in Berlin, the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, said Ukraine's allies would establish a coalition to supply Kiev with long-range artillery. Sarah Rainsford has been following events from Kiev.
I think, what this meeting really boiled down to was that kind of show of unity. And I think it's interesting that, of course, Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, was there at the heart of it, trying to bring Germany and France together and also giving himself a place at that somewhat top table inside the EU. Donald Tusk has been extremely outspoken about the need to support Ukraine, and he was tweeting about that, talking about the need not for words for Ukraine, but ammunition. That, of course, is absolutely vital, as we know that soldiers on the front line here in Ukraine have had to ration that ammunition.
Sarah Rainsford. You're listening to the World News from the BBC. The spokesman for the United Nations Secretary-General has again warned that an Israeli ground operation in the Gazan city of Rafah would be a humanitarian catastrophe. Zefan Dujarric spoke to journalists shortly after Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, said he'd approved plans for a military assault on the city. President Biden has warned that an assault on Rafah would breach a red line. The United Nations says increasing numbers of children in the Haitian capital Port-au-Prince are going hungry as unrest continues. The children's charity UNICEF says life-threatening malnutrition is widespread, concentrated in the capital's poorest areas. Will Grant is in the coastal city of Cap Haïtien.
Some aid is now making it into the country, yet it's nowhere near sufficient to cope with the scale of this emergency. In the political realm, the Transitional Council has been agreed. However, the gangs that control the capital, Port-au-Prince, don't recognise the council and have threatened its members in very, very stark language. So Haiti remains stuck in a complex and dangerous situation, and the civilian population caught between the politicians and the gang.
The authorities in northeastern Argentina say dozens of retired police officers have responded to a call for help to combat spiraling violence in the city of Rosario. The appeal was launched this week by the governor of Santa Fe after weeks of heavy fighting between criminal gangs in which 4 bystanders have been killed. A top-flight women's football match in Britain was delayed by 30 minutes on Friday due to a sock mix-up. Arsenal turned up wearing white socks, clashing with Chelsea's home kit. The Gunners had to buy black socks from the Chelsea on-site megastore and cover up the Blues logo with tape. BBC News.
This is The Real Story from the BBC. I'm Celia Hatton with your weekly deep dive into a story that's making news and changing lives. This week, the social media app that's become part of the everyday routines of a growing number of Americans.
I use TikTok to teach millions of people about science and space. I just use it for recreational use, so on my way to the train or anytime I'm bored. I get most of my news actually through TikTok.
It's kind of a source of entertainment. Sometimes it's stuff that I'm learning about, and then there's kind of a lot of activism on TikTok too. So it kind of just keeps me informed.
TikTok has had explosive growth, particularly among young people. But the future of the app in the United States is looking uncertain.
Congress is moving swiftly on this proposal that would require TikTok, this social media giant, to separate itself from its China-based owner, ByteDance, or face a ban in U.S. app stores.
In compliance with Chinese law, TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, is legally required to support the work of the Chinese Communist Party. We need this bill because we simply cannot allow an app controlled by our nation's foremost adversary and competitor to take over the American media landscape.
TikTok says their critics are wrong. But this week, the U.S. House of Representatives voted by 352 to 65 to support a bill which the company says amounts to a possible ban. Donald Trump tried to take on TikTok when in the White House, but now he and his supporters in Congress think challenging TikTok would actually help someone they perceive as a bigger threat, Facebook owner Mark Zuckerberg.
When the government moves into forcing the sale of TikTok, who is going to buy it? Who will be the next to control the data of over 170 million Americans? Are we going to trust Mark Zuckerberg to control their data? I certainly don't.
President Joe Biden says he'll sign the bill if it passes both houses of Congress. But in an election year, it could be a risky move. There could be a huge potential for blowback from America's avid TikTok users.
I'm aware that I'm giving my data, right? I'm aware. I'm okay with it. Let me make that decision. You don't need to make that for me. To be quite honest, everything on the internet is a security risk. And so this may have a parent company that is foreign, but we have just as many security risks with domestic companies as well. And so I would love to see our lawmakers spend this much time and energy to pass more data protection overall for all Americans on all platforms, on everything.
So what's the power of TikTok? China's state media says it's a beloved tool of fun, fortune, and free speech. Is TikTok a security threat, or is the real problem big tech in general? Let's look at the future of one of the world's most popular apps with help from our guests. Louise Matsakis is a freelance journalist covering technology and China. She writes You May Also Like, a newspaper about e-commerce and Chinese tech giants. She joins us from Los Angeles. Louise, hello. I have a question I'm going to pose to all of our guests, and I'm going to put it to you first. What's the moment you first realized that TikTok was something different, that it was going to be a force to be reckoned with?
Thanks for having me, Celia. I was looking back, and 5 years ago this month, I wrote a guide for Wired magazine about how to use TikTok. And I remember then it really struck me that this was an app that was really driven by an algorithm. So it was looking at how long you spend looking at each video, what you like, what you share. And that was just so fundamentally different from the way that American social media platforms have operated historically. Facebook, Instagram, these are apps that revolve around who you know in real life, right? You follow people you meet, you follow people you meet in college, maybe you go to school with or whom you work with. And sort of the content is driven by those personal connections. Even on an app like YouTube, the first thing you do is you search for something, right? It's sort of driven by your proactive behavior. Whereas it really struck me that when you open TikTok, you just see a video and then you scroll to the next one and then the next one and the next one. And this is an app that really is controlled by what are your interests, and your For You page, which is sort of, the main way that you access that algorithm, can be so fundamentally different from the person next to you.
Thank you, Louise. So, Jeremy Goldkorn, let's turn to you. You're an editorial fellow at Asia Society's China File website, founding editor-in-chief of the China Project, and co-founder of the Seneca podcast. Jeremy lived in China for more than 20 years, but now lives in the U.S., where he joins us from Nashville, Tennessee. So, Jeremy, what's the moment you first realized that TikTok was something different?
Well, I have to say, I thought ByteDance was something different long before TikTok even existed, because when it was founded in 2012, it was the first Chinese internet company that seemed to have completely made up a whole new business model and not copied anything at all from any kind of American internet platform. But TikTok itself, I realized, was a force, because I live here in Nashville, which is, known as Music City. It's the center of country music in the United States. And I have a friend who works in the music business who had seen the success of a song called Old Town Road by Lil Nas X. And his initial success was on TikTok. That's where the song went viral. And this music industry executive said to me, it's time to quit the business because everything is about to change. And I think he was right.
Thanks, Jeremy. Lindsay Gorman, let's turn to you. Lindsay is head of technology and the geopolitics team at the Transatlantic Nonpartisan Alliance for Securing Democracy. She joins us from Austin, Texas. Lindsay, we'll put the same question to you. What's the moment you first realized that TikTok was going to be a force to be reckoned with?
Yeah, thanks, Celia. Well, for me, it was in 2019, actually. Our organization studies foreign influence on social media platforms, and we come at it from a national security perspective. So we've been tracking Russian and Chinese state influence on traditional social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. And in 2019, around September, the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong were really kicking up. And we were seeing these very popular protest hashtags, Stand with Hong Kong and the like, that were used by protesters. And it was a very online protest, in addition to, obviously, people coming out in the streets of Hong Kong. And we were seeing on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, these hashtags were really going viral. And on TikTok, they were curiously not really there. Just the numbers were vastly different. And so that's when I started to really get interested in TikTok.
It's a fascinating past and future for TikTok. Louise Matsakis, I want to turn back to the basics when it comes to TikTok. What is it? What can you tell us about it?
So TikTok is a short form video platform. And when you open the app, the first thing you see is this feed called the For You page. And what it is it's basically just an endless scroll of videos. And so over time, as you scroll through those videos, the app detects, how long are you lingering on maybe fashion videos versus, funny videos of pets? Do you like politics videos, or do you swipe right past them? You can follow people the same way that you can on, Instagram or YouTube or other apps. You can message people if you both follow one another. But I think that algorithm is really what makes it different.
So who uses this app, and where globally do they use it?
That's a great question. So I think historically, because the way that TikTok came to the United States is that ByteDance, the parent company, bought this app called Musical.ly, which was a lip syncing app for teens. So when TikTok first, started expanding internationally, it was sort of known as this teen and tween app. But in the last few years, like with other social media platforms, TikTok's user base has begun to age. So I would say right now, sort of the core TikTok demographic is certainly Gen Z, but it's not all teenagers. I would say, a really big component of this is millennials and also a fair number of sort of older people. And the app has about 1 billion to, 1.2 billion users basically all over the world, aside from India, which was the first country to ban the app back in 2020.
So Jeremy, where did TikTok's powerful algorithm get it started, and how did it become so successful?
Well, ByteDance, the parent company, launched in 2012 in Beijing. And in fact, their very first app was called Neihan Duanzi, which was a way of circulating jokes, some of them slightly off color. And it, in fact, was eventually shut down by the Chinese government in 2018. But the product that was a breakout for them was called 今日头条, or like today's headlines. And it is a fascinating service because Chinese news is very boring. News websites are highly censored and controlled by the government. So to find interesting news on Chinese news websites is pretty tough because the interesting stuff is never going to be kind of on the homepage. And they figured out that if they used an algorithm, they could figure out what would interest people. So it might be news stories about, their local hometown, or, gossip about real estate, or something that isn't just the sort of heavy political news of the day on the front page of the news websites. And I think that in some ways has been the secret sauce to all of their good products. They figured out that an algorithm can understand you almost better than you do yourself. And the same approach has been taken, obviously, with TikTok.
Jeremy, thanks. It's so interesting to hear how it got its start. Now, Lindsay, at the core of this debate around TikTok is who actually controls the app. Can you give us an overview of where TikTok is based and its relationship to the parent company, ByteDance?
Well, TikTok US is technically based in the United States, but it is owned by ByteDance, which is its parent company, and is now technically incorporated in the Cayman Islands, but is headquartered in Beijing. I think it's important to understand that in China, there really isn't such a thing as a truly private company. Ultimately, all Chinese companies, like ByteDance, are implements of the state in some way. And so that's where the real concern comes in about this ownership, that with a social media platform that's so powerful, that has such a large user base, where the algorithm is so opaque, that the ones ultimately pulling the strings on that algorithm could be sitting in Beijing.
Now, Lindsay, you mentioned some of the concerns around TikTok. Let's get into that a bit more. We asked to speak to someone from TikTok, but no one was available. But 12 months ago, when the U.S. Senate was considering its own measures that might have impacted TikTok's American operations, my colleague Tim Frank spoke to Michael Beckerman. He's TikTok's head of public policy in the Americas.
We're not owned by a state-owned enterprise. And when people say it's Chinese-owned, the founder of the company happens to be a Chinese engineer who used to work at Microsoft and has built the company. But when people are talking about banning a company that is beloved by over 100 million Americans and 1 billion people around the world, where we're really exporting, the great culture of America and all these terrific videos that people are doing, it's really unfortunate and it's very un-American.
People are saying that, look, the reality is, you may say it's simply not happening and it simply wouldn't happen, but the reality is that under Chinese law, ByteDance, which owns TikTok, it does have clear links to the Chinese state. The Chinese government has a golden share in it. And under Chinese law, it is conceivable that the app could be compelled to turn over personal data to Beijing.
Well, no, one, we've said multiple times we'd never share data with the Chinese government.
Even if it was ordained by Chinese law.
Of course. Well, one, I mean, so TikTok, is not available in China. We're incorporated in the United States, and we're also under U.S. law. I think that detail is often ignored. We do have to comply with the laws of the land where we operate. And in the U.S. specifically, we've been moving U.S. user data over to Oracle and putting data controls in place. But also to clarify, when you said the golden chair, that is for an entity within China that is not the owner of TikTok. And so, again, I know international law is very complex and there's a lot of different pieces here, but the reality is our company and any company, you're required to comply with the laws in the country where you're operating. And for the United States, TikTok has an incorporation here and we're required to comply with U.S. law.
Michael Beckerman from TikTok speaking to the BBC a year ago. So that's the company's official view, but it's still up for debate. And I know my guests are going to have a lot to say about this. Is ByteDance a Chinese company? Jeremy, let's start with you.
Yes, it is a Chinese company. It's like a 100% Chinese company, and it's completely disingenuous to suggest that somehow, TikTok is not owned by that company. I do think, though, in the United States, sometimes it does get mischaracterized as though ByteDance is an actual agent of the Chinese Communist Party. Like pretty much all Chinese companies, I believe ByteDance does not welcome interference or guidance from the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party. But unfortunately for them, they don't have a choice. And that's where the problem is.
Louise, what would you have to say to this?
Yeah, I think that, this is definitely a Chinese company. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But I do think that it does often get maybe, not as much attention that, this is a company that has American investors, global investors from other parts of the world. But I think more than sort of the hypothetical of, okay, well, if the Chinese Communist Party asked TikTok to do something, they would have a hard time saying no. I think, the next question naturally follows is what would they ask and how likely is it that we would be able to tell if TikTok, gave into some sort of demand, right? Like what exactly are we worried about here? I think what's happened sort of, the last 4 years that this debate has been going on about whether or not TikTok should be banned in the US, what I've seen time and time again is sort of these hypotheticals about like, okay, well, this could happen or that could happen because of the ownership structure of ByteDance. But I sort of want to know, like, what exactly are we worried about? Is it election interference? Is it sort of other concerns? Because I think that the hypothetical is always going to be there. But, every time you get in a car, the hypothetical that you get in an accident is possible, right? So, like, you have to get into the specifics.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics. At the core of the debate is whether a social media giant operating in the United States, but with links to China, can be trusted. So let's hear the experience of Christina Criddle, a technology writer for the Financial Times.
There are definite security concerns, and I know about these firsthand because my own TikTok account was accessed by ByteDance staff in China, and they used my personal information, including my location data, to track me and to try and find out where I was. And that was basically because I was reporting a lot about the company, finding lots of exclusives on the company. So it has been used in this kind of way. What hasn't been shown is whether the Chinese state has ever used TikTok in this way.
So Christina learned in December 2022 that she'd been tracked by ByteDance employees, an incident the company says was not authorized by the company's management. So, Louise, let's go back to you again. There's an example. What do you think we should take from this case then? Is it a rogue incident, or should it give us a warning about what TikTok or ByteDance is capable of?
First, let me be, completely clear that this incident was an utter disaster. So what happened here was that an internal security team at TikTok was found to have accessed TikTok data in order to track and try and figure out who was leaking internal information to a number of reporters, including the Financial Times reporter we just heard from. There was also a BuzzFeed reporter named Emily. And this was definitely disturbing. But I also actually reported on this team. And what I found was a sort of rogue team of often former Western law enforcement and intelligence officials who were sort of able to act with impunity, and they were interviewing employees internally. They were sort of running this internal police department that in a lot of ways I think was definitely overreaching. But sort of like the Financial Times reporter said there, I still don't know whether that was evidence of TikTok's Chinese ownership being a problem or a sort of more banal issue with their corporate governance, right? Like that showed me that there were problems with how the data was being accessed, but I'm not sure if that's a problem that couldn't happen in other companies.
Lindsay Gorman, what do you have to say in response to this case in particular before we move on?
Yeah, so I don't think this is something we should just accept as a normal course of business from social media companies. I think it speaks to a disregard for the institutions of our democracy, such as a free press, a willingness to surveil and track people who might threaten the company. And, you know, what it really reminds me of, and I think this also speaks to the intent where an incident where the Chinese state was involved, not online, but it reminds me of an incident that the Department of Justice filed an indictment on back in 2022, where they accused Chinese state security services of harassing a congressional candidate for New York office who was in fact a Chinese dissident, had participated in the Tiananmen Square protests, the Hong Kong protests, and had moved to the United States and was running for office in New York State. And the DOJ complaint alleged that these Chinese security agents were trying to dig up information about his whereabouts, trying to dig up dirt on him to denigrate his candidacy. And they even went so far as to say to a private investigator to consider beating him, this candidate, until he can't run for election. So I think that's what we're up against here, a Chinese state that is willing to go to these extreme lengths, including meddling in very nefarious ways in U.S. elections. And, you know, in this incident, it wasn't on TikTok itself. But I think that's the concern, and that's what the spying issue with the journalists really reminds me of.
Jeremy, is TikTok really a national security threat in the United States? I mean, it's banned from phones and other devices owned by the federal government or employees of the federal government. Why? What do they fear?
Well, I think there are a few fears. I think perhaps the primary fear is the harvesting of data that could be used to harm U.S. national security interests. So that would be if TikTok is installed on phones that government officials are using. I think there are other fears that are perhaps more speculative. I think one mistake perhaps TikTok just made this week was in response to the bill in the House, they flashed to many TikTok users' devices, I don't know if all of them in the United States, a message calling on them to call up their government representative and, you know, protest the potential ban of TikTok. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, well, that's kind of proven what TikTok could do. You know, imagine there was a war over Taiwan, the US and China are in a war. TikTok could flash a message to every single TikTok user with disinformation or misinformation. So, I mean, that is absolutely technically possible. And it's also possible because of the fact that ByteDance is headquartered in Beijing, maybe not legally, but they're actual operationally, and therefore would have to comply with the government request. However, I do think a lot of the discussion about TikTok in China is verging on sort of yellow peril territory. There's some of the tone of the rhetoric is that, you know, nothing that's even faintly connected to China can be trusted. So it can make it difficult to think clearly about it, because on the one hand, you do have some slightly paranoid rhetoric. On the other hand, I think the risks are very real. I think Louise previously used the analogy of, you know, if you get in a car and go for a drive, you know that bad things could happen, but you're willing to take that risk. And I think that's true. But on the other hand, we have, you know, very advanced systems of laws and safety requirements and rules such as you have to wear a seatbelt to try and minimize that risk. So I think addressing the risk of TikTok is a completely reasonable thing for the United States to do. I don't know if this bill is the best way of doing it.
There's so much more still to cover, but let's pause for a moment because we do have to take a short break now. Louise Matsakis, Jeremy Goldkorn, and Lindsay Gorman, stay right where you are. And we're going to pick this up right after the news when the real story continues.
Distribution of the BBC World Service in the U.S. is made possible by American Public Media, producer and distributor of award-winning public radio content. APM, American Public Media, with support from Sonar. Used by millions of developers, Sonar ensures that all code, including code written by AI, is secure, reliable, and maintainable. More at sonarsource.ai.
Next time on the New Yorker Radio Hour, I'll talk with philosopher Judith Butler, who helped bring new ideas about gender into the world.
I'm not against sex assignment, don't get me wrong. I'm not against it at all. But if we think that that has to stay the same throughout time, then we might be making a mistake.
Judith Butler, next time on the New Yorker Radio Hour. Listen this morning at 10 on 93.9 FM or get the podcast.
Coming up on The Real Story in the next half hour, we're asking if TikTok really poses a threat. The U.S. Congress has passed a bill that might force TikTok to cut ties with its parent company in China. Next, we'll ask if that can really happen, or would Beijing stand in the way? Or are there other ways to address the problems surrounding the massively popular app? All that after summary of the news.
BBC News with Fiona MacDonald. The UN humanitarian chief has warned that up to 5 million people in war-torn Sudan could face catastrophic hunger in the coming months. Martin Griffiths appealed to the parties to the conflict to urgently allow the delivery of aid, describing it as a critical lifeline. Donald Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence says he cannot in good conscience back his old boss's bid for the presidency. Mr. Pence said the decision was based on profound differences over policy. Germany, France and Poland have agreed to step up the provision of weapons to assist Ukraine in its battle against the Russian invasion. The German Chancellor said Ukraine's allies would supply Kiev with much-needed long-range artillery. The spokesperson for the UN Secretary-General has again warned that an Israeli ground operation in Rafah in Gaza would be a humanitarian catastrophe. More than 1 million displaced people are sheltering there. The former head of Brazil's army has told prosecutors that Jair Bolsonaro discussed a possible military coup with him after the former right-wing president's electoral defeat in October 2022. Mr. Bolsonaro has always denied instigating unrest after Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was elected. UN officials say increasing numbers of children in Haiti are going hungry as unrest continues. The situation in the capital, Port-au-Prince, was described as tense and volatile. In the latest technical failure to affect a Boeing airplane, a United Airlines flight has landed in Oregon with an external panel missing. The defect was only noticed after the plane had landed safely. And the start of a top-flight women's football match in Britain was delayed after Arsenal turned up in the same white socks as the host Chelsea. Arsenal were forced to buy black socks from Chelsea's megastore. BBC News.
You're listening to The Real Story from the BBC World Service with me, Celia Hatton. This week, we're looking at TikTok. Is this an app full of goofy videos, or does it pose a U.S. national security threat, or both? We have a great panel of guests this week. Louise Matsakis is a freelance journalist covering technology and China. She writes You May Also Like, a newsletter about e-commerce and Chinese tech giants. She joins us from Los Angeles. Jeremy Goldkorn is an editorial fellow at the Asia Society's China File website. founding editor-in-chief of the China Project and co-founder of the Seneca podcast. He lived in China for more than 20 years, but now lives in the U.S., where he joins us from Nashville, Tennessee. And Lindsay Gorman, head of technology and geopolitics team at the Transatlantic Nonpartisan Alliance for Securing Democracy. She joins us from Austin, Texas. You'll hear more from them in just a moment. But first, we've just explored why some believe TikTok poses a threat. So what are U.S. politicians doing about it? As you heard earlier, this week, the House of Representatives voted overwhelmingly in favor of a bill called the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act. If the bill is backed by the Senate, signed by the president, and survives legal challenges in the courts, it could result in the effective banning of TikTok in the United States. But a lot could happen before that takes place. TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, would first get the option to sell the app to an American entity within a 6-month time period. Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher co-sponsored the bill.
TikTok is a threat to our national security because it is owned by ByteDance, which does the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party. We know this because ByteDance leadership says so and because Chinese law requires it. This bill therefore forces TikTok to break up with the Chinese Communist Party. It does not apply to American companies. It only applies to companies subject to the control of foreign adversaries defined by Congress.
Most of his colleagues in the House agreed. The bill overwhelmingly passed the chamber, 352 votes to 65. But Democrat Robert Garcia was one of those voting no.
Any ban on TikTok is not just banning the freedom of expression. You are literally causing huge harm to our national economy. We have small business owners that are here and small business owners from across the country that use TikTok to move our economy forward. All of our social media platforms need to be treated equally and need to be treated the same way. To single out TikTok in this way, we believe is dangerous and certainly against freedom of expression.
Well, that last point, concerns that this bill might curb Americans' freedom of expression, is shared by campaigners for the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. Here's what they said. The House's TikTok bill is a ban and it's blatant censorship. Today, the House of Representatives voted to violate the First Amendment rights of more than half the country. The Senate must reject this unconstitutional and reckless bill. For his part, President Biden has said he'd sign the bill if it passes both houses of Congress. Now let's turn to our guests. How likely is it that this bill will actually make it through? Now we have to remember it's an election year, and this is a really popular app used by millions of Americans every day. Louise, let's start with you.
I feel like kind of the girl who has cried wolf with the TikTok ban. For 4 years now, there's sort of been a number of different legislative efforts to get this ban passed. But I would say that this is definitely the most likely effort so far to actually work. The reason that I think that is you're seeing a lot of sort of unusual political alliances. You know, when former President Trump proposed this in 2020, it was sort of a Republican-led effort. And now you've actually seen Trump flip-flop. So now Trump is saying that he doesn't want to see the app banned. But at the same time, a number of Democrats have taken up this issue as well. So right now, President Biden is saying that he would sign the legislation, but you also have a number of Democrats in the Senate where the bill needs to go first who are saying that they are not going to support it. So while there's now both sort of Republican and Democratic support that's uneven, it's very bipartisan. So that's why I am sort of optimistic, if you can use that word in this case, that this bill
I'm having trouble connecting to the internet. For more info, check the Home app.
actually going to be put into law.
Just say with you for a second, what would this bill actually do? It would force a possible sale. What if that doesn't happen?
So this bill is still pretty big. It's a very short piece of legislation. So what would happen is that if months to either divest the U.S. business, so sell it off to another investor, or to leave the U.S. market altogether. But there are a lot of questions about what sort of corporate structure would appease lawmakers. It's not clear exactly like how that sale would have to happen, whether all the forms would have to be signed within 180 days. And it's also not clear if you were only to sell TikTok US, what would happen to the rest of the app, right? Would this be a separate platform from TikTok in France or, TikTok in South Africa? Or would there still be some sort of integration? Or would it be an app that competes against the international version of TikTok?
Lindsay, let's turn over to you. How likely do you think it is that this bill will actually make it through?
The fact that it passed the House overwhelmingly. When it was originally introduced, it was 50-0 out of committee. We've gotten some dissenting votes when it passed the broader House, but now the Senate has to take it up. And we've already had the chairman and the vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, probably the committee that's most relevant to this bill, come out in support of it. They say they will vote yes. So I think the chances are fairly good that there will be some action here. There's just an incredible amount of urgency, I think, now, given that we are in an election year and that some of these national security concerns being raised by lawmakers are around the ability for the Chinese Communist Party to use TikTok to influence the U.S. election in November.
I want to just hinge on the fact that you said very close to the start of your answer that it's encouraging that this bill has made it this far. So can you just talk a little bit about your feelings about this bill? I mean, you clearly support it.
Yeah, I do. I think it's not a perfect solution, but we've really run out the clock on action when it comes to TikTok. And one of the things that I think is helpful about this bill is it really gets to the heart of the matter. It's not saying, let's just ban TikTok. It's not trying to keep TikTok's data somehow in the United States. It's really about this ownership question and influence. And that's the real concern, that the Chinese Communist Party could influence TikTok through its ownership relationship. And so that's what's trying to be severed.
Okay, so let's keep looking at that link then. Let's look at the reactions within China to all of this. The Chinese state media say efforts to force a TikTok sale are another attempt at theft on a grand scale. Commentator Hu Xijin had this to say on the state media outlet The Global Times.
TikTok has conquered young Americans and become popular all over the world. Yet it is not controlled by American capital. Thus, some American political elites are simply green with envy and can't wait to snatch it up or ban it if they can't.
Jeremy, your response. Do you think that the Chinese government could tell ByteDance not to sell?
Oh, absolutely they could. I'd like to say it's remarkable hypocrisy. For the person like Hu Xijin, who works for, has most of his career worked for Chinese propaganda and media, who call out the U.S. for, trying to block a foreign-owned website when no major foreign-owned website. News or social media platforms are available in China.
That's true. I mean, we also have to point out that Hu Xijin has a massive Twitter following, and Twitter is banned inside China, isn't it?
Yes, I know. The hypocrisy is extraordinary. But yeah, indeed, the Chinese government could absolutely stop ByteDance from selling TikTok, and they might very well do that.
Could this lead to the further balkanization of the internet, Jeremy?
Yes, it could. And that's one of the things I don't like about this bill, is that it seems to me a very heavy-handed way of regulating TikTok. I don't know if there's an easy way to do it that doesn't lead to the further balkanization of the internet. Maybe that is just a reality we have to face.
Louise, what's your thought on this? I mean, U.S. companies already dominate the internet globally. Is there a danger a more fractured internet will harm Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I definitely think that that's a huge risk here. For example, if this bill were to pass, what's to stop, the leader of India, Modi, from turning around and saying it's a national security risk that YouTube in India or Facebook or Instagram is controlled by a foreign power. Therefore, we're going to pass a law forcing Google and Meta to sell those businesses to an Indian investor, right? I think the problem with this bill is that it signals that, people who support it are okay with sacrificing the global internet for U.S. national security. And if you want to make that argument, I think that perhaps there is a way to make it with merits. And the other concern that I have is whether or not the ownership structure is exactly the right way to deal with these issues. For example, if you're concerned about election interference, for sure, the Chinese Communist Party could put pressure on TikTok to change its algorithm in a certain way. But what we've seen so far is that Russia, China, and, other foreign powers around the world have tried to sway elections, to spread disinformation on platforms that they do not own, and in many cases have been successful at that. So is the ownership structure the way that this actually happens? I would say that history shows us it's not. To go back to the car analogy, I feel safer driving around in a car because every single car manufacturer is required to include seatbelts. Is it better to just ban the Chinese car in this case, or to pass, more comprehensive legislation that is the equivalent of a seatbelt for the internet? I worry that, efforts to pass a national privacy law in the U.S. have sort of stalled, and all of the attention is now focused on this bill. And I think that that's by design, right? It's better for Silicon Valley if the focus is on TikTok and getting rid of one of their major competitors. And I worry that while this is happening and we're only discussing this single app, for example, is there, Chinese disinformation spreading on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, which has gutted its moderation teams and historically, I would say, has been a much more prominent platform for Chinese dissidents, for discussions that I think the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like. And it's also the platform where Chinese propagandists also spend a lot of their time. Mm-hmm. So I worry that we're focusing on this app that has not really been a platform for that sort of activity. And I don't think it hasn't been because it's owned by ByteDance. I think it just hasn't been sort of because of the way of the internet, right, and where different communities congregate.
Lindsay, I want to turn back to you in this concept that this bill could force all companies to choose effectively between one axis or the other, between the U.S. or China. What's your response to that?
I would push back on that notion slightly. Look, I think we're definitely in an age of de-risking or decoupling, and we're, as democracies, evaluating to what extent we should have dependence on autocratic states like Russia and China, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure. We saw this in the case of debates over Huawei, another Chinese telecommunications company's presence in our 5G and advanced telecommunications networks. And the United States and many other democracies decided that that was too big a risk. I don't think putting some of these guardrails on necessarily means that we're on a slippery slope to a full decoupling. And perhaps there are some in the United States that would advocate for that. But I do think that there's a fine line to walk here while recognizing and mitigating against some of the national security threats. And I would also add that this idea of a forced sale is not something that's without precedent. A few years ago, the LGBTQ dating app Grindr actually was subject to a similar national security action. It had been owned by another Chinese company, Kunlun Tech, and the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, the committee that reviews potential concerns concerning foreign influence ties, actually decided that this was too big a national security risk, largely based on these questions of the data and access to the data. And so it was required to be sold to a company that was not headquartered in China.
Let's just talk practicalities for a
interested in purchasing TikTok. But I think, going back to what Jeremy said, any investors that are interested in making this acquisition are going to have to navigate whether or not ByteDance will actually allow the app to be sold. And I think some of the biggest entities in the U.S. that could afford potentially a $50 billion price tag are other companies in Silicon Valley. And in those cases, I don't know if there would be, an anti-competitive concern there from other parts of the U.S. government. Like, would it really make sense to allow a Google or a Meta or an Amazon to purchase another major platform?
And of course, let's not forget possible legal challenges. Even if this bill is signed into law, it could face lengthy challenges in the courts. Lindsay, can you take us through what hurdles might come up for it?
One question that has come up in Washington in the context of this bill is whether there is a bill of attainder issue, which is a legal term that essentially requires legislation not to single out a particular company. And as far as I understand, the lawyers are reviewing whether this bill does have this bill of attainder issue, which could present some kind of challenge in the case that we do go through with a ban. If TikTok and ByteDance are not able to divest in the 180-day period, that's when I think we'd be more likely to see some of these First Amendment challenges that the ACLU and other organizations have put forward in the context of related attempts to ban the app.
That's right. I mean, the ACLU, we have to remember, says that this bill represents a threat to the First Amendment that guarantees freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Lindsay, what's your perspective on this? Do you think that this really could pose a challenge to the bill?
I think it's less likely than in the case of some bills that just tried to ban the app outright. We did see during the Trump administration tried to ban the app using legal authorities under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And that did get hung up in U.S. courts. I think what's different here is Congress passing a national security-based law that provides a mitigation is on a much stronger legal footing than an outright attempt to only ban the app.
Okay, let's move on. Let's move past this bill and on to alternatives, because many people say that this bill isn't the way to address concerns surrounding TikTok. There are other examples of other countries that have dealt with TikTok in different ways. For example, India has passed an outright ban on the app. Other countries have been tightening their data privacy laws. Jeremy, what lessons are there for the United States in potentially drafting laws to address the concerns that some have regarding TikTok and other social media apps like it?
I don't think there are actually, honestly, any good lessons out there. This is a brave new world where, the globalized internet has all kinds of consequences that some of them we still don't know. And of course, we're in the year where artificial intelligence is a new factor in the mix. So I don't really think there's anything out there that I know of that the U.S. could learn from. One attempt to regulate TikTok that I thought was a promising direction was the so-called Project Texas, which was the idea that TikTok should have all of its U.S. data stored only in U.S. territory, and it was going to be in Texas, and that it would be supervised by a U.S. company, Oracle. And I would be interested to see more detail on that and how that might work. But I don't think this is an easy question. I don't think to do as it pleases, because I think there are some potentially very big risks associated with it.
Okay, so if we stick with our car without seatbelts analogy, Louise, what do you think? How could we put seatbelts onto this car and other cars like it, other apps? I mean, many argue that what the United States really needs is a data protection law, not just a bill that looks at TikTok's ownership.
I completely agree that we need a national privacy law that will regulate how personal data is bought and sold, how it's transferred, how that data can be collected, and the ways that it can be used. That will be the equivalent of sort of a seatbelt for every car. And I think that we can also look at what happened in India when they banned TikTok in 2020. I do think that there are two lessons there. And one is that we saw that the winners were YouTube and Meta. So I think, similarly here, if TikTok does end up being banned, I think we can expect a lot of that business to flow back to sort of the existing social media giants. And the second thing is that India has continued to have to play whack-a-mole with Chinese apps. So they've had to ban other Chinese apps. You saw, other platforms that Indians were using that were also owned by Chinese entities, and they just continue to have to sort of ban them in batches. And I'm not sure that getting rid of this one app necessarily solved any particular problem, except for if the problem was that, Meta didn't have enough market share in India. That certainly has been solved. But I think it was just sort of such a narrow approach. And I worry that we'll have the same issue here, and that after this election later this year, we'll see that sort of there were Chinese disinformation efforts that were very worrisome that were happening on other platforms that we weren't paying as much attention to.
Look, clearly a best case solution would be a risk-based framework that Congress or the executive branch could clearly lay out that spells out very precisely what are the national security risks we are worried about, not just with TikTok, but with all what I call autocratic apps, social media platforms, other e-commerce platforms, apps that are based in an autocratic country like China or Russia. We need a risk-based framework so that we're not playing whack-a-mole, so that we don't have to have this lengthy discussion every single time, because there will be another Chinese app. Lemonade was popping up a few months ago. There's going to be another one. This is a vibrant technology ecosystem coming out of Beijing and Shanghai, and there are going to be more Chinese platforms that we have to deal with. So a more rigorous risk-based framework would be by far a better outcome than focusing in on particular apps here and there. And this framework would stop. Is it a data security risk? Is there a propaganda and influence risk? Is there another risk that we should be worried about? And make recommendations on mitigations that are proportional to the risks. One class of apps that comes up a lot in these conversations are the e-commerce platforms, Temu and Shein, where people are buying clothes and other goods online. Is that a national security risk? I would put that maybe in a data security risk, but clearly a lower order risk than a data plus propaganda platform that we have in TikTok. So there the mitigation would be lower, maybe not a forced sale, maybe just a ban on government devices, people who have access to sensitive data that the app could potentially scrape. This more holistic framework is clearly where we need to go. Unfortunately, we, I think, don't have time to do that before the November election, and TikTok is clearly the biggest threat in the bunch right now, but I would like to see a more thorough risk-based framework. On the question of Project Texas, I still think it was really inadequate. It didn't fit the bill, because even if data is localized in the United States, what's the risk when it comes to this data? The risk is that data on Americans can be used to influence them. Even if you house all that data in the United States, the Chinese Communist Party could still direct ByteDance and direct TikTok to use that data without it ever having to go to China to influence Americans in particular ways for its political purposes. So that's why I think the Project Texas really did fall a bit flat in DC, because it wasn't getting at the heart of the risk.
Okay, if we're talking about possible solutions, though, are we misdirecting our focus? We've been talking a lot about government solutions to dealing with any threats or concerns posed by TikTok and other social media apps. But what about the addictive qualities of TikTok, or those who say it's really up to parents to watch over how young people use the app?
I think that's a very good point. I think before answering it, I should say that perhaps one of the reasons why TikTok is creating such a controversy in the United States is that the people who make the laws have teenage children, and they are very worried about the effects of TikTok on their kids. So I don't think it's just a China concern. I think you're absolutely right that parents should do more to monitor, what their children are doing on digital devices. And I think that's a problem facing probably parents across the world, but very much so in the United States. But that's not just a TikTok problem. That's the social media problem.
I totally agree. I think that what you're seeing happen in Congress right now is sort of the conflation of two things that are perhaps the only issues that Democrats and Republicans agree on. And one of them is certainly being tough on China. But the other is this belief that social media is harmful to children. And so I definitely think this bill is a response to that. And that is a sort of fundamental piece of the picture here that sometimes gets lost when the discussion is only about Beijing.
Before we close, let's do a bit of crystal ball gazing. What shape will TikTok be in 1 year's time or 5 years' time? Will Americans still have easy access to it? Let's get your predictions. Let's start with you, Lindsay Gorman.
I think it's very likely that it could be banned because China does not allow a sale to go through, and it becomes very clear who's calling the shots on ByteDance and TikTok.
Jeremy.
I think predictions are a fool's game, and I'm going to predict that this bill doesn't actually end up passing because of Donald Trump turning against this. So, for example, in my home state of Tennessee, we have two senators. One of them, his name is Marsha Blackburn, who's a very loyal Trumpist and will parrot anything he says. And she's been one of the most vocal critics of TikTok for years now. But now that he's changed his mind, I don't see her dissenting. So I think it's going to hit political problems before November, and it's not going to pass. And I think TikTok's still going to be used and abused by American teens at this time next year.
Louise, last to you.
I think within a year, something will pass in Congress. I don't know if it's going to be this bill or another bill, but I bet in March 2025, TikTok is still caught up in legal challenges, and this app is still being used by Americans in the meantime.
Okay, well, thank you to all three of you. Thank you for giving some predictions, although I know it's a tricky thing to do. Well, that's it for this week on The Real Story. Thanks to our guests. Louise Matsakis is a freelance journalist covering technology and China. Jeremy Goldkorn is an editorial fellow at the Asia Society's China File website, founding editor-in-chief of the China Project, and co-founder of the Sinica podcast. And Lindsay Gorman, head of technology and geopolitics team at the Transatlantic Nonpartisan Alliance for Securing Democracy. For this week, from me, Celia Hatton, and the team, that's The Real Story. Thanks for your company, and do join us again next time.
On the next Radio Lab.
Once you're on life support, it's really, really hard for you to die.
One ICU doctor struggle with prolonging life versus allowing death. Did I try too hard to save this person's life?
I wrote a book about how people should value palliative care in the ICU, and here I was thinking.
That's the next Radio Lab.
Today at noon on WNYC.
You're listening to WNYC and live streaming at WNYC.org. Partly cloudy skies for the overnight and lows in the mid-40s. Sunny today with highs in the upper 50s, and partly sunny for tomorrow, a slight chance of morning showers and highs in the upper 50s.
This is WNYC, FM, HD, and AM, New York.
This is Alex Ritson with the newsroom.
Donald Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence says he won't be backing his former running mate in this year's election. Little suspense over the outcome as Russians continue to vote in Vladimir Putin's election.
This is a 3-day-long election that includes voting in parts of Ukraine under Russian occupation. When the official result is announced, it's expected to be a Putin landslide.
The humanitarian crisis builds in Haiti with efforts to enforce a curfew in a crime-ridden state of near anarchy.
The gangs have control over many arterial roads in and out of the capital, and the criminality is